to build the temple during this time, okay? So we need to move on, okay? But I want you to see right here in this verse that we're in right now, 3 and 4, about this one who is riding on a red horse, who is given the power to take peace from the earth. And I want you to notice what he says right here in verse 4. It says here that men should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Now, what we see right here, when this happens, and think about this, with all the chaos going on and the church gone, and you think there's a lot of murders and people just acting crazy and all kinds of things that are happening. Think about what's going to be when there's no church here, when the light of the gospel's not here, when the power of the Holy Spirit is really in the church today and we are being used of God to keep sin back. But think about when that's all gone. It says here that he's going to give men the ability to slay one another with a great sword. Now, in the original Greek, this word for this great sword is really spoken here. It's really a shorter weapon that's used by the Greeks, and a lot of times it's used for hand-to-hand combat, but also for assassinations, for revolt, for massacres, and wholesale slaughter. So what I'm trying to say that when all this starts to break out, there's going to be commonplace in the world for people to hate one another and kill one another, okay? Now, if you remember that Jesus said that this is only the beginning of the birth pains, the beginning pains of God's wrath. Jesus said all these things are about the beginning of the birth pains. So let's move on. I want to now go to verse 5, and let's look at the third seal. And then he says, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come. Again, you see the command coming from the throne of God. And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hands. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. So in this case, the black horse, black signifies many times in Scripture famine. Now I just want you to consider, when there's world war breaking out, it's going to have a tremendous effect on this world's capability for supplying a food supply to the rest of the world. I just want you to think about that, okay? See, it's going to spawn global hunger. And even as we said from the Olivet Discourse, Jesus foretold this. He said, nation will rise against nation, and there will be famines. He says that in Matthew 24, verse 7. So we see this because the rider, as we see in this verse, its rider had a pair of scales. Now this is literally a famine. It's not some kind of, we're going to spiritualize this. Because of the wars that broke out and because of the food chain being hampered, and there's going to be a great famine that's going to appear throughout the world. See, a pair of scales was a common measuring device back in the ancient days. And this indicates that the scarcity of food would lead to rationing and food lines. Now, have any of you ever been involved in rationing or food lines, or you remember the gas lines? Remember? Some of you remember that? When we had the great embargo and people lined up for what? For hours and hours just to get a couple of gallons of gasoline when we had the oil embargo, okay? I told you I've been reading this book called Hitler's Cross, and it kind of gives a picture of the circumstances that I think are very similar. That when you have war break out, and then when those wars have such an effect on the world, and people are starving, and it says right here is that the scales, a denarius was almost like one day's work. And it says here that this little bit of what it says right here about the barley, okay, it talks here about that a quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. As I said, a denarius was the standard for a day's work. So it's going to take a day's work just to get a little bit of food that probably doesn't satisfy what people are going to need back then, let alone a whole family, okay? So I want you to think about this. We know that many times in wars, the results of that is not only just the devastation of buildings and in countrysides and in industry being blown up and many people losing their lives. But we also know is that it happens from there is that pestilence happens, and famine happens. And what we see right here is that, as I mentioned about this book I'm reading, after World War I, Germany was totally devastated from all the destruction that she experienced, and rightfully so. She was involved in a war that she shouldn't have been. But what we see, though, is that inflation took off. As I mentioned, I think last week, a mark at one time had a certain value against the dollar. But by the time the recession or what was it, 1929, I wasn't here for that, thank goodness. I don't think any of us were, the Great Depression they call about it. But by the time that happened, it says that there was hundreds of thousands of marks equaled $1. And the people were literally starving. And it led then for this one who came about, Hitler, and decided that he was going to change the situation that would happen to, and he was making all these wonderful promises. And people were in a condition, they were ready for it. They're looking for it. In the same way as we talked about last week, it's because of these kind of conditions that Satan will take the Antichrist and he will elevate him to such a point that he takes not only, and this is what I'm reading in this book right now, Hitler was using the religion of the day, and actually this whole book premises is that the cross, the swastika, the cross of Hitler, you won't believe this, but many churches took down the cross that represent Christianity, and they replaced it with the swastika cross, Hitler's cross. And I'm reading a whole chapter now where there was such things going on between the religious pastors and that, and how Hitler was going to take his own leaders and put them into the church, and they would change the whole philosophy, the whole way of worship would be trying to set himself up. Churches became, you walk in a church and you'd see nothing but Nazi signs all the way around, and people looked at it like this is the thing we do. And so we're going to see something very similar right here, okay? So let me get back to this. I want to tell you about what happens when war happens. Usually we see famines, we see pestilence, and we see much killing that goes on. I was doing some research and looking at these 3 things that he talks about: famine, pestilence, and the sword. And one of the things that was really interesting is that I found in 2 Kings chapter 6, there's a story there. This happened at the time of Elisha, and it was a time when Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, was actually at that time put a siege around Samaria. And it's interesting is that when there's a siege like that, there's no food coming in. And it's interesting is that that the king of Israel himself, while he was under siege, he was going through Samaria, and a woman starts to cry out to him, "Can you help me? Can you help me?" And he said, "Well, what can I do for you?" Well, this woman, we agreed together that we would eat my son and then eat her son. And so we spent the first day and we ate my son. And now the next day, she was to do that, and she refuses that, and now she's hiding her son. And what I'm trying to impress you, I don't want to be gory or nothing like that, but I'm just trying to tell you is that when war comes out and famine happens, and even the basic things for eating and being able to supply for your needs, you don't have them available. You could see what's happening, what's going to happen at this time, that even people will go and kill one another just to get a loaf of bread or to satisfy their physical needs. So one thing he says right here in this verse with this a seal right here with the black horse, he says, don't harm the oil and the wine. Now, oil was used in the preparation of bread, and wine was considered necessary for cooking and purifying water. They are going to become a luxury at that particular time. People are going to hoard it, protect it. As I mentioned earlier, inflation is going to be so bad during the tribulation that precious metals actually become worthless. And those who think that and we have it today. I hear it on TV all the time. Protect your investment. Buy gold. That's one way to protect yourself, with inflation rising and everything else, and you never know if the economy is going to crash. But man, if you got gold, you're not going to find yourself in a situation not having the means to take care of yourself and provide for yourself, okay? But I want to show you that during this period of time, those who are hoarding diamonds, gold, and silver, it's going to be useless, okay? Remember, we talked about this last week. Antichrist, in his numeric system of 666, he will be the one who's going to control people by controlling whether they could buy or sell. And he's going to replace gold, silver, and paper money, okay? Let me just give you an example of this. Go over to Ezekiel chapter 7. Ezekiel chapter 7. Now listen to these verses. I'm going to pick it up at verse 14. They have blown the trumpet and made everything ready, but none goes to battle, for my wrath is upon all their multitude. The sword is without, pestilence and famine are within. He who is in the field dies by the sword, and him who is in the city famine and pestilence devour. And if any survivors escape, they will be on the mountains like doves of the valleys, all of them mourning, each one over his iniquity. All hands are feeble, and all knees turn to water. They put on sackcloth, and horror covers their shame, and all of their faces and baldness on their heads. Now listen to this. They cast their silver into the streets, and their gold is like an unclean thing. Their silver and gold are not but able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They cannot satisfy their hunger or fill their stomachs with it, for it is with the stumbling block of their iniquity. So you see here, he's talking about the day of the wrath of the Lord. And he's saying their gold and precious stones and all that, it ain't going to help them whatsoever. They will experience the very fact of this famine and this pestilence and being hungry, and they won't be able to satisfy themselves. Just a warning. Remember in James, listen to this. He speaks about the end times a little bit. Look at James chapter 5. And he says here, come now, verse 1, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotten and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have had laid up treasures in the last days. So I don't care whether you're rich or poor. This one, the Antichrist, will have full control of everything. And your riches won't be able to save you. It's going to be meaningless. Well, let's go to the next one, see if I could get through this one. The fourth seal. Look at verses 6 and 7. 7 and 8, I'm sorry. When he'd opened this fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. Again, you see, this is a command from the throne of God. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, and with famine, and pestilence, and by wild beasts on the earth. So we see here that this fourth one comes riding on a pale horse. Now, pale is a Greek word from which we get the English word chlorophyll. And it really kind of describes pale green decomposition of a corpse. In other words, if maybe the doctor here, he could... have you been in some of your studies and corpse are rotting or they're turning color and that? It certainly doesn't look like my red skin, because... Okay. Now, what this horse represents, okay, and his name is Death. And the rider of this pale horse is Death. And he's given authority to kill more than a quarter of the world's population. Now, that's one interpretation you could take. It says here, if you look at it again, he says, and they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence. Now, some take it that means that a fourth of the population of the earth will be destroyed, killed. Could mean that there's another interpretation you could look at. I know I had two different positions on this. So they were given authority over the fourth of the earth. This could also mean that World War III, the famine, and the plague affects only a portion of the world. So 3/4 of the world remain unafflicted. In other words, they're saying that he was given authority over a fourth of the earth. Meaning it could be, what we're looking at is that the Middle East and all the wars that we just talked about earlier really kind of encapsulates probably a quarter of the total world. So, most of the death would be coming from them. That's possible. Or some really believe that he's talking about worldwide. And if famine has happened worldwide, I believe then that that's probably the right interpretation, that this war and these famines and pestilence is really going to affect probably around 2 billion people, because there's currently a little over 8 billion people today. But you think of the devastation that happened in World War II, where 6 million Jews. Can you imagine 2 billion people affected by this war and famine and pestilence? Now, here's another thing. Today, we have the capability with nuclear power that you could see 2 billion people. Think of that. Theologians who've really studied this, and I kind of go along with some of them, I believe that we will see nuclear power being used in the latter days, particularly during the time of the tribulation. There's going to be such devastation. Now, here's one thing I want to talk about here. It says that Hades followed. Now, I want you to remember this. Most of all of this judgment that's coming down measured, but it's going to cost them their life. That their life being martyred gives them salvation. Salvation will still be the same. Faith alone in Jesus Christ alone, by the blood that was shed on the cross to pay for sin. Learn that Hades is a place of two people who died. Remember that? So the ungodly, when death comes to them, it says Hades follows with, and they will go directly to Hades. Now we know that Lazarus, when he died, he went to Hades, but he went in the bosom of Abraham, and he was taken care of. You remember that. Remember, the rich man could see, there was a gulf set between them, but he could see over there, he could see Lazarus. And he said, "Oh, Father Abraham, please send Lazarus." See, he's still a rich man and got people wanting to be slaves for him, and he's looking down at Lazarus, okay? He's still, in his mind, Lazarus is a poor old beggar. And so please send that poor old beggar to minister to me. You see the attitude? He hasn't changed. But what I want to say to you is that all these who, during this time when God is pouring out judgment, it says that when they are killed, they go to Hades. And they will then appear before the white throne. Let's pick up at verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and the sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open. And then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. Now listen to this. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades, dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is because of their ungodliness and their rejection of Christ. Because I want you to see that, as I mentioned this, and we'll see this as we go through these coming chapters. The grace and mercy of God has been available throughout this time. The 144,000 are preaching Christ crucified. The two witnesses in Israel, when the temple sacrifices, those two witnesses are pointing to the fact that Christ is the real Messiah. And so there's going to be this wonderful, even during the time of judgment, that God, remember, judgment comes in order to grab a hold of us and wake us up. And they've lost their lives, and they go to Hades, as it says right here, is that Hades follows them, okay, all those who died. And now we see at the great white throne judgment, and this happens after the 1,000-year millennial reign, and they are going to be raised from the dead. Because I want you to know this. God made us body, soul, and spirit. And whether we're in Christ, we will be raised. And someday we'll have our glorified bodies. But the dead, those who are in Hades, because of their sinfulness and rejection of the Messiah, they will be raised physically. And they will be given a body, but now their life is going to be before us. God's grace and mercy. So then they will be thrown into the lake of fire, body, soul, and spirit, to die an eternal death and suffer for eternity. Well, I've run. No, I don't know where they get the purgatory from. You know, to me, when what I understand of purgatory is that yes, they're in a place like Hades. They have the possibility to get out there for them, or if you pray enough for them, we may get them out so they then have a chance to go into paradise, which is hogwash. I don't know where to get it. I've searched the scriptures. I don't see any